On a crisp Friday evening, my wife of 8 years, Stephanie, and I received an invitation to her best friend Alice's birthday party. Stephanie and Alice had been inseparable since college, and we'd attended countless gatherings at Alice's over the years. This night seemed no different. Stephanie looked stunning in a fitted blue dress that perfectly accentuated her figure. Her hair cascaded in soft waves, framing her glowing face. As she twirled before me, asking how she looked, I couldn't help but smile. "As lovely as ever," I said. She laughed, brushing off my compliment. By 8 p.m., we arrived at Alice's lively home. The air buzzed with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Alice greeted us warmly at the door, pulling Stephanie into a tight hug. "You both look amazing," she exclaimed before ushering us into the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces. For the first part of the evening, Stephanie and I stayed together, mingling with friends and enjoying a few drinks. The atmosphere was light, filled with animated conversations and bursts of laughter. That was when I noticed him. He stood across the room, tall and confident, cradling a whiskey glass. His sharp eyes lingered on Stephanie, a small, self-assured smirk playing on his lips. Something about the way he looked at her sent a jolt through me, a mix of unease and anger I couldn't quite place. I nudged Stephanie, gesturing subtly toward him. "Who's that guy?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "Oh, that's Ryan," she replied nonchalantly, glancing at him. "He's a friend of Alice's. I met him at her housewarming last year." Ryan noticed our exchange and raised his glass in a small, smug acknowledgement. Stephanie smiled politely in return before turning to me with a soft laugh. "Don't be ridiculous, Ben. He's harmless." I tried to shake the feeling, chalking it up to overthinking. Stephanie wasn't giving him any undue attention, and I had no reason to distrust her. Yet, the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. As the evening wore on, we both mingled separately. It wasn't until I realized I hadn't seen Stephanie for some time that my unease returned. I scanned the crowded room, weaving through groups of people, but she was nowhere to be found. I found Alice by the dining area, chatting animatedly. "Have you seen Stephanie?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "She was heading to the kitchen last I saw," Alice said with a thoughtful pause. Thanking her, I moved toward the kitchen. Rounding the corner, I stopped abruptly. There she was, standing close to Ryan at the counter. Too close. Their heads leaned together as they spoke, her soft laughter punctuating the low murmur of his voice. One hand held her drink, while the other toyed absently with her necklace. I felt a sharp sting in my chest, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Without thinking, I marched toward them. "Stephanie," I said sharply, my voice cutting through the moment. They turned, startled. Stephanie's smile faltered, her eyes widening slightly. "Hey, Ben," she said, her tone uncertain. I ignored Ryan and fixed my gaze on her. "Can we talk?" She hesitated but nodded. "Sure." We moved back to the living room, where the noise of the party surrounded us. I leaned closer, keeping my voice low but firm. "What were you doing with him?" She frowned, her expression defensive. "We were just talking." "What's the big deal?" "The big deal," I said, struggling to keep calm, "is the way he was all over you. It didn't look like a casual conversation." Her arms crossed, and she sighed in exasperation. "You're overreacting. Ryan's just a friend of Alice's. There's nothing going on." I shook my head, frustration mounting. "The way he looks at you, it's disrespectful. To me and to our marriage." Her expression softened slightly. "If it bothered you, I'm sorry. But I promise, it's nothing. Can we please just enjoy the evening?" Reluctantly, I let it go. But the uneasy feeling in my chest refused to dissipate. An hour later, as I chatted with a coworker, Stephanie excused herself to grab another drink. Time passed, and she didn't return. My unease grew. I searched the kitchen, the patio, the den, nothing. Finally, I ventured down a quiet hallway. The laughter and music from the party faded as I approached the closed doors. At the last door, I paused. Muffled voices seeped through the wood. One was distinctly Stephanie's. I leaned closer, heart pounding, and heard soft laughter. It was quickly followed by hushed whispers and something else. A sound I couldn't ignore. Summoning all my courage, I pushed the door open. The sight before me shattered everything. Stephanie was on the bed, her body entangled with Ryan's, her dress discarded on the floor. His shirt hung open, exposing his chest. At first, they didn't notice me, too absorbed in each other. "Stephanie," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. She turned, her face pale and eyes wide with shock. In that moment, my world collapsed. As I raised my voice barely above a whisper, I said, "God forbid, Ben, this isn't safe." My voice quivered, shaking with barely controlled rage. "I've seen enough." Ryan leaned back casually against the headboard, his expression utterly indifferent. "It's not what it looks like, man. Calm down," he said nonchalantly. I gave a bitter, disbelieving laugh. "Not what it looks like. Really? That's the best you've got?" Stephanie, tears streaming down her face, frantically tried to cover herself with the sheet. The sight made my chest feel like it was going to burst. I shook my head and stormed out of the room, my mind reeling. How could she do this, to me, to us? She trailed behind me, her voice frantic and trembling. "Ben, please. Stop. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking." I spun around, my face hot with anger. "Oh, so now it's the alcohol's fault?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "When you smiled at him across the room earlier, were you thinking then? Don't act like this just happened out of nowhere." She flinched, guilt written all over her face. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "I love you, Ben," she said, her voice breaking. "Love me?" I shouted. "If you loved me, you wouldn't degrade me like this. You don't betray someone you love." My voice had grown loud enough that other partygoers started to notice. Alice, a mutual friend, approached us with a worried look. "What's going on?" Alice asked, her tone cautious. I turned to her with icy disdain. "You might want to ask your friend," I replied. "She has a lot to explain." Stephanie sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. Alice glanced between us, clearly uncomfortable. "Ben, maybe you two should talk privately," she suggested, trying to diffuse the tension. But I'd had enough. I grabbed my coat and turned to leave. "I'm done talking. Enjoy the rest of your party," I said coldly before walking out the door. Once outside, I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands shook. My thoughts spiraled out of control as I tried to process what had just happened. Images of Stephanie and Ryan together replayed in my mind, each one more vivid and painful than the last. I felt an uncontrollable storm of emotions: anger, hurt, betrayal, but above all, an overwhelming sense of loss. I couldn't go home. I couldn't face her. So I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to escape the pain and confusion. My phone buzzed repeatedly, Stephanie's name lighting up the screen every time. I couldn't answer. I wasn't ready to hear her voice, let alone her excuses. Eventually, I found myself at Damon's house. He was one of the few people I knew I could rely on. It was almost 2 in the morning when I knocked on his door. "Ben." "What the hell?" "It's late," Damon said groggily as he opened the door. "I'm sorry, man," I stammered, my voice shaky. "I didn't know where else to go." "There's an emergency." Damon's expression shifted to concern. He stepped aside to let me in. I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling as I tried to compose myself. "She betrayed me, Damon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I saw her, with Ryan. In a bedroom. Together." Damon's eyes widened in shock. He stared at me for a moment, trying to process what I'd said. "I can't believe it," he finally muttered. "I saw it with my own eyes," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. I can't go back home right now. I can't even look at her." Damon nodded slowly. "You don't have to be alone tonight. Stay here," he said firmly. "Are you sure?" I asked, still dazed. "Yes." "You're not going anywhere." "Grateful," I nodded. "Thank you," I whispered. The next morning, I returned home to collect my belongings. Stephanie was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She stood up as soon as she saw me. "Ben, please," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking." I didn't respond. I brushed past her and went upstairs to grab some clothes. She followed me, her presence heavy in the doorway. "Ben," she pleaded, "I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." I turned to her, my voice low but firm. "A mistake? That's what you're calling it." She averted her gaze, unable to meet my eyes. The guilt on her face was unmistakable. "You don't accidentally end up in bed with someone," I said, my chest tightening with anger and grief. "I can't stay here. I'm filing for divorce." Her face went pale. "Please, Ben, don't do this. I'll do anything to fix this. Just give me another chance," she begged, tears streaming down her face. But I couldn't. I shook my head. "It's too late." The divorce process took only a few months. Stephanie tried reaching out a few more times, but I ignored her calls. Damon stayed by my side, helping me through the hardest moments. Though the pain lingered, I eventually learned to cope and focus on rebuilding my life. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was the only choice I had left.